She buried men alive, burned cities with birds, and slaughtered thousands under the moonlit snow. Yet the church calls her a saint. In the frozen darkness of a 10th century winter night, the chilling screams of 5,000 dying men echoed across blood-stained fields outside ancient Kiev, their agony forever etched into the cold silence of history. But their executioner was no barbarian warlord, no savage conqueror lusting merely for conquest. She was a woman, a grieving widow who wielded her sorrow like a blade, orchestrating a campaign of vengeance so ruthless it stands among history's bloodiest women. This is the true crime from history. Few dare to tell a tale hidden beneath the sanctified glow of icons and the whispered prayers of believers where the dark side of saints collides with the violent truths of medieval power. Her name was Princess Olga of Kiev, a figure revered across Eastern Europe as a bringer of faith and civilization, yet remembered in hushed tones as a woman who transformed grief into genocide, who drowned an entire tribe's existence in blood and fire. How does a mass murderer become a holy figure venerated among forgotten queens and women in power, immortalized in golden mosaics and solemn hymns? How does a woman who devised some of the most inventive executions in human history stand enshrined as equal to the apostles? The answers lie buried in the unsolved mysteries of the past, beneath 1,000 years of religious revisionism, political necessity, and the uncomfortable reality that history's saints often have more blood on their hands than its sinners. Tonight, we will delve into the savage reality behind the sacred myth following the twisted path of a woman whose legacy shaped the destiny of Eastern Europe, and whose story forces us to ask if redemption is truly possible, or if it's merely history rewriting murder into sainthood. For beyond the flickering candlelight that now glows before icons of St. Olga lies a legacy of fire steel and the relentless will of one woman who refused to bow to fate, a ruler whose name still burns with both horror and reverence, a reminder that the unsolved mysteries of history are often carved in blood. In the harsh crucible of 10th century Eastern Europe, where loyalty was measured in severed heads and the weight of power dripped red from the blade, Princess Olga of Kiev was born into a world poised on the edge of chaos, a landscape crawling with violent tribes, Viking warlords and bloody empires whose shifting borders glistened under northern snow. It was an age that has slipped from popular memory, hidden among the shadows of forgotten queens and true crime from history. Yet it remains a time when women in power could wield unimaginable cruelty and cunning to secure their thrones, proving that history's most brutal women were often its most necessary rulers. The Kievan Rus, a loose federation strung along great rivers that glimmered like silver veins connecting Scandinavia to the majesty of Byzantium, was less a unified nation than a vast chessboard, where the dark side of saints and killer queens moved their pieces in deadly silence. Born sometime around 890 CE in the northern reaches of what would become Russia, Olga likely took her first breaths in Skaf, a frontier town where Viking merchants bartered furs and slaves for silver and silk, a place where fortunes rose and fell on the flick of a blade, and where unsolved mysteries of the past were written in the blood of the nameless. The ruling dynasty of the Rus, descended from the legendary Rurik, maintained its grip through tribute terror and marriages, as strategic as military conquests alliances, forged not from love, but from necessity in a region where betrayal was as common as snowfall and mercy was an expensive luxury. Into this merciless world stepped Olga, whose marriage to Prince Igor of Kiev was undoubtedly political, meant to bind the wild frontiers to the city's iron core. Yet even among killer queens and violent women in history, the chronicles hint that theirs was not a union of pure convenience alone. Rare whispers speak of a bond built on mutual respect and shared ambition, a fragile ember of affection glowing amid the iron cold. Such a notion seems almost impossible in a time when women were traded like coin, used as pawns in games of bloody empires. But the story of Olga and Igor stands apart, a testament to the strange contradictions that breed both saints and monsters. Yet lurking beyond their royal walls, trouble festered among the forest people known as The Drevlians, a fierce tribe whose very name sprang from the ancient Slavic word for trees, a people who wore the dense woodlands west of Kiev as armor and who simmered under the weight of Kievan tribute, ever testing the limits of their submission, ever probing for the fatal crack in their overlord's resolve. It was a tension that seethed like hot coals beneath a blanket of snow, setting the stage for one of the deadliest revenge stories in history. A saga of retribution that would transform a grieving widow into a woman whose name still resonates among the legends of violent women in history. A ruler whose path to sainthood would first be paved in blood and horror, and whose legacy would become one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the past. But before the world would tremble beneath Olga's wrath, before birds carried fire into the sky and cities burned in the name of vengeance, a single fatal decision by Prince Igor would shatter the fragile peace and trigger a chain of events drenched in crimson, a miscalculation that would leave him screaming into the silent woods as the Drevlians prepared to carve his name into the annals of history's most gruesome executions. In the bitter cold of 945 CE, under skies as gray as forged iron, Prince Igor of Kiev made a choice that would echo like a death knell across the bloody empires of Eastern Europe, a choice that would ignite one of the deadliest revenge stories ever recorded among history's most brutal women. Fresh from collecting the annual tribute imposed upon the Drevlians, Igor dared to return for a second helping an act of greed, or perhaps desperation in this ruthless world, where killer queens and warrior princes battled for survival. Even the mightiest rulers were shackled to the constant need for wealth and power. Yet the Drevlians were no docile subjects. They were forest dwellers who drew their very identity from the trees, a people forged in the dark silence of ancient woodlands, whose freedom burned hotter than any gold demanded by foreign overlords. And so when Igor arrived, demanding more than the sacred customs allowed, he signed his own death warrant, and with it, condemned his bloodline to the pages of true crime from history. They captured him near the town of Iskarost, seizing not merely a prince, but a symbol of Kievan dominance they despised. What happened next stands among history's most gruesome executions, a tale told in hushed tones across centuries, a single act so grotesque it lingers like a bloodstain upon the chronicles of violent women in history and the unsolved mysteries of the past. The Drevlians bent 2 young birch trees to the frozen ground, tying Igor's legs to each trembling trunk. And then, in a silence that swallowed even the wind, they let the trees snap upright. Flesh ripped, bones shattered. The prince's body split apart in a shower of blood and viscera, his screams echoing through the forest like the cries of some wounded god. This wasn't just murder, it was a message carved into the language of medieval cruelty. In a single act, the Drevlians declared themselves unshackled from Kievan power, proclaiming that even women in power and the mighty rulers of bloody empires could be torn asunder if they reached too greedily into the pockets of free men. By using living trees as executioners, they broadcast their defiance, linking themselves to the very forest that had kept them free for generations. Yet as the snow soaked red beneath Igor's shredded remains, the Drevlians made another far more catastrophic mistake, a mistake that would summon the wrath of one of history's bloodiest women. In the haze of victory, flush with the taste of independence, they believed they could bind their future to Kievan power through a single woman. They believed Princess Olga, now widowed, might accept a marriage alliance with their Prince Mal, thereby uniting 2 peoples under Drevlian rule and erasing the stain of Igor's death. But they did not understand the dark side of saints, nor did they fathom the abyss behind a grieving woman's eyes, for, while Olga wept no tears in public, inside her burned the cold, methodical fury of a ruler born for vengeance. Her silence was not surrender, it was calculation. And in that silence lay the seeds of a slaughter that would become one of the deadliest revenge sagas among forgotten queens and violent women in history, a saga that would soon paint the snows of ancient Rus with rivers of blood and etch Princess Olga's name indelibly into the dark chronicles of killer queens who changed the world. And so, while the Drevlians congratulated themselves and prepared their emissaries for a royal proposal, they unknowingly stood at the edge of annihilation, for the woman they believed they could tame was about to teach them that sometimes the cost of ambition is extinction itself, and the true power of a queen lies not merely in her crown, but in the fury she unleashes upon those who dare to rip away what she loves, and that, as history would soon reveal, was merely the beginning. So it was that the Drevlians, drunk on the scent of victory and blinded by the arrogance that often precedes annihilation, dispatched 20 of their finest ambassadors to Kiev, draped in rich garments and jeweled ornaments, certain that Princess Olga, a woman they saw as nothing more than a pawn in the bloody empires of men, would accept their proposal of marriage to their Prince Mal. But they did not understand that within this woman, beneath the regal silk and the calm mask of grief, lurked the soul of one of history's bloodiest women, a mind as precise as a blade and a fury cold as ice. For she was a killer queen whose name would one day echo across chronicles of true crime, from history and the dark side of saints alike. Olga received the Drevlian envoys with apparent hospitality, speaking soft words of welcome and suggesting they rest in their boat while she arranged a more fitting reception, a move that dripped with deceptive grace, for behind those words simmered a vengeance that belonged among the most brutal executions and the deadliest revenge tales ever told. As the envoys waited proud and oblivious beneath a sky heavy with winter, Olga's servants labored through the night to dig a vast pit within her palace courtyard, a grave wide enough to swallow the 20 men who believed they'd come to secure an empire through marriage. At dawn, with the chill still clinging to the stones, the Drevlians were carried in their own boat, lifted like honored guests and gently lowered into the pit. Then Olga, standing at the brink of that open grave, gazed down at the bewildered faces staring back at her, and with words as sharp as any blade asked them, "Is this honor to your taste?" And as the soil began to rain upon them, muffling their screams, suffocating their hope, and drowning their pride beneath the earth, the Drevlians learned too late that they were not dealing with a grieving widow, but with one of the most violent women in history, whose vengeance would soon scorch the pages of forgotten queens and unsolved mysteries. And yet, astonishing as it was, the burial of 20 men alive was merely Olga's opening act, for the woman who had just turned her palace into a graveyard was already plotting a second, even more monstrous deception that would bring her closer to the total obliteration of her enemies. But the burial of 20 men beneath the earth was merely the opening chord in Olga's symphony of vengeance for the princess who would one day stand immortalized among saints, was far from finished painting her path in blood, and what came next would burn itself into the chronicles of true crime from history and into the dark side of saints forever. Determined to eliminate the Drevlian leadership piece by piece, Olga sent word to the tribe feigning consideration of their marriage proposal and requested that the highest nobles and wisest men of Drevlian society come to Kiev to counsel her in person, a request draped in the polite silk of diplomacy, yet concealing the serrated edges of one of history's most brutal executions. The Drevlians, blinded by arrogance and desperate to secure an alliance that might heal the wound left by Prince Igor's murder, agreed without hesitation, believing the widow subdued, imagining her eager to bind her fate to theirs. So these nobles arrived in Kiev, men who had shaped Drevlian politics, whose voices had commanded armies and whose names would soon vanish into the unsolved mysteries of the past victims of a killer queen, whose genius for deception would cement her place among history's bloodiest women. Olga welcomed them warmly, her demeanor the perfect mask of hospitality and statecraft, offering them the comfort of her private bathhouse to wash away the fatigue of travel, a gesture that seemed benign, even regal to men accustomed to the rituals of bloody empires and women in power. Once the nobles were inside, surrounded by steam and the illusion of safety, Olga's soldiers barred the doors from the outside and without hesitation set the wooden structure ablaze. The nobles' laughter turned to frantic pounding as flames devoured the fragrant cedar walls, their shouts rising to panicked screams that clawed at the sky, the steam transforming into choking smoke as skin blistered and peeled from bone, a spectacle of vengeance so violent it would stand alongside the deadliest revenge in the annals of violent women in history and forgotten queens whose wrath shaped kingdoms. Yet even this monstrous theater was but another step, for Olga's thirst for retribution remained unquenched, and the woman who incinerated nobles alive was already preparing to don the mask of the grieving widow, once more orchestrating a funeral feast, where blood would flow like wine and the Drevlian nobility would face extinction under her calculated gaze. Yet even as the charred scent of burnt flesh hung over Kiev, Princess Olga was only beginning the grand design of vengeance that would secure her name forever among history's bloodiest women and the most violent women in history, for the killer queen who had buried men alive and roasted nobles within a bathhouse was ready to stage one of the most chilling chapters in true crime from history, a massacre wrapped in the silken guise of ritual mourning. Sending word once more to the Drevlians, she proclaimed that as a grieving widow bound by sacred custom, she wished to visit their territory and hold a funeral feast in honor of her slain husband, Prince Igor. A gesture seemingly drenched in sorrow and diplomacy, yet pulsing beneath with the sinister rhythm of the deadliest revenge. The Drevlians, perhaps believing the worst was behind them, or perhaps simply unable to imagine further treachery cloaked beneath holy rites, agreed and prepared vast quantities of meat, honeyed mead and delicacies worthy of bloody empires and forgotten queens. Olga arrived in Iskarost and cloaked in widow's black, her eyes cast downward in sorrow, weeping and tearing at her hair beside her husband's grave, performing grief so convincingly that even those who had orchestrated Igor's murder were moved, forgetting for a fatal moment that women in power can wield daggers behind veils of tears. But as the funeral feast commenced, as mead flowed like rivers, and the Drevlians lost themselves in drunken celebration, Olga gave the signal. In an instant, steel flashed, and the quiet forest night exploded into carnage. Her soldiers fell upon the drunken revelers with swords and axes, hacking down men too dazed to lift their arms in defense, turning a feast into one of history's biggest massacres and a bloody spectacle fit for chronicles of violent women in history and the dark side of saints. The snow ran red as noble blood soaked the earth, mingling with spilled mead in a grotesque parody of sacred rituals, and by dawn, 5,000 Drevlians lay dead, their hopes of dominion forever extinguished beneath Olga's wrath. Yet for all the horror unleashed beneath the guise of holy mourning, even this was not enough for a ruler whose vengeance knew no limits, for the woman who orchestrated a funeral feast of blood was already preparing her final masterpiece, a fiery onslaught that would burn an entire city to ashes, with nothing but wings and sulfur as her weapons. But the woman who had turned a funeral feast into a blood-soaked graveyard was not yet finished inscribing her name among history's bloodiest women and the chronicles of violent women in history, for Princess Olga's vengeance had one final act, an act so ingenious, so monstrous, that it remains etched among true crime from history and the deadliest revenge tales ever whispered through the centuries. The Drevlians shattered and leaderless retreated behind the wooden walls of Iskarost, desperate to protect the remnants of their people and to survive the wrath of the killer queen who now hunted them. For an entire year, the city held out its defenders, weary but defiant, clinging to hope against the might of a ruler who had already proven herself capable of unspeakable cruelty and brilliant deception. Yet even the stoutest walls could not shield them from the mind of a woman in power who belonged among the dark side of saints and the unsolved mysteries of the past. Feigning weariness with the siege, Olga sent messengers promising mercy and peace, claiming she would spare Iskarost if each household merely offered a token tribute of 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows, a demand so modest that it seemed almost laughable to the beleaguered survivors. Eager to believe salvation was within their grasp, the Drevlians gathered the birds, never suspecting that these fragile creatures would soon transform into instruments of annihilation. For on a night when the stars hung cold and distant, Olga's soldiers tied pieces of sulfur wrapped in cloth to the legs of every pigeon and sparrow. When the birds were released, they flew instinctively home to their nests tucked beneath the thatched roofs and timber eaves of Iskarost. Moments later, the city ignited, as if struck by lightning from the hand of a vengeful god, flames leaping from rooftop to rooftop, devouring streets in a firestorm so swift and ferocious that screams of burning children mingled with the crackle of collapsing beams. Those who fled the inferno were cut down by waiting soldiers. Those who remained were choked by smoke or consumed by fire, and by dawn, Iskarost lay in smoldering ruins, its people dead or enslaved, its culture erased as though it had never existed, leaving behind only ash and silence to mark its passing. Yet for all the horrors she unleashed upon the Drevlians, the woman who wielded birds as weapons and reduced a city to embers would soon step onto an entirely different stage, where the fires of vengeance would be replaced by the flickering glow of sacred candles, and where a ruler once drenched in blood would seek redemption in the shadowed halls of Byzantium. From the ashes of Iskarost, where the cries of burning innocence still seemed to linger like ghosts upon the bitter winds, Princess Olga emerged as one of history's bloodiest women, and a figure whose story remains seared into the chronicles of violent women in history and true crime from history alike, for she had not simply avenged her husband's death. She had performed a cultural genocide, wiping the Drevlian people off the map of memory and carving her dominion deeper into the bloody empires of Eastern Europe. With Iskarost smoldering behind her, Olga claimed the lands once ruled by the Drevlians, dividing their territories among loyal supporters, tightening her grip on a realm that had learned through fire and blood that she was no pawn, but a killer queen whose vengeance transcended the boundaries of ordinary wrath. Those few Drevlians who survived the inferno found themselves bound in chains, sold into slavery across distant lands, or forced to toil under crushing tribute payments that would bleed their descendants for generations, transforming a once proud tribe into whispers and ruins buried beneath forest moss. In this single relentless campaign, Olga demonstrated that women in power could not only endure in the ruthless theater of bloody empires, but could outmatch any man in cunning and cruelty, standing shoulder to shoulder with the ruthless female rulers, whose names echo among the unsolved mysteries and dark side of saints that haunt history's blood-soaked dynasties. The Drevlians ceased to exist as a distinct people erased not merely through death but through deliberate erasure of culture, identity, and legacy, ensuring that future generations would remember only the victorious ruler and not the victims whose screams were carried away by winter winds. It is here that Olga's narrative begins to transform from that of a blood-drenched avenger to a nation-builder, for while she bathed her enemies in fire and blood, she also sowed the seeds of political unity and centralized authority, reshaping Kievan Rus from a loose collection of principalities into a more cohesive power. Her rule in the aftermath of the Drevlian destruction was marked not solely by terror, but by shrewd administration tax reforms and the consolidation of royal authority, ensuring that tribute flowed reliably into Kiev's coffers, and that foreign traders, whether Viking adventurers or Byzantine merchants, could conduct their business under the protection of laws she helped to codify. Thus, Olga stands as one of the great paradoxes among forgotten queens and ruthless female rulers, a woman who annihilated entire peoples without remorse, yet whose vision and iron rule laid foundations for the state her grandson Vladimir the Great would one day baptize into Christianity. But the story of Olga of Kiev does not end amid ashes and screams alone, for even as she reigned over lands drenched in the blood of her enemies, another transformation was taking root within her, a metamorphosis that would soon carry her across the glittering seas to Byzantium, where golden domes rose into the heavens, and where the woman known as a killer queen would seek the salvation of her soul in the sacred light of Christendom. It was a journey that would not only redefine her legacy, but would entwine her name forever with the dark side of saints, blurring the line between sinner and saint in ways that would echo through centuries of faith power and unsolved mysteries yet to be fully untangled. And yet, astonishing as it seems, the same woman who had orchestrated some of the bloodiest massacres in medieval chronicles, a killer queen whose vengeance had scorched entire cities into ash and whose legend loomed large among violent women in history, and true crime from history would undergo a transformation so profound that it stands as one of history's most shocking reversals, a metamorphosis that places Olga of Kiev squarely at the crossroads between the dark side of saints and the shining promise of redemption. Sometime around 955, or perhaps as late as 957 CE, as Kievan Rus simmered in the aftermath of her bloody consolidation of power, Olga journeyed across the Black Sea to Constantinople, the dazzling capital of the Byzantine Empire, where golden domes sparkled like captured suns, and the murmur of hymns drifted through cavernous halls of marble and mosaic. The reasons for this pilgrimage remain among the unsolved mysteries that haunt the corridors of history's bloody empires. Was it sincere spiritual yearning, a calculated political maneuver to align her realm with the Eastern Roman Colossus, or a desperate bid to wash the blood from her hands in the sacred waters of baptism? Chroniclers differ, some claiming that Olga fell under the spell of Byzantine splendor and the theological intricacies of Eastern Christianity, while others hint at a shrewd queen maneuvering her people closer to the economic and military might of Constantinople, for even ruthless female rulers understood that faith and power often marched hand in hand. Inside the hallowed walls of the Hagia Sophia, amidst flickering candles and clouds of incense that shimmered like ghosts of lost empires, Olga received baptism, taking the Christian name Helena, her once iron-willed visage now partially cloaked in the veils of devotion. And yet the dark side of saints could not be banished so easily, for the woman kneeling before icons had not forgotten the scent of burning flesh, nor the taste of vengeance, and the same calculating mind that had devised some of history's deadliest revenge now turned itself toward building churches, funding missions, and weaving new political alliances under the symbol of the cross. Despite her conversion, her son Sviatoslav remained steadfastly pagan, a warrior prince who scorned baptism and who would die a pagan's death on foreign soil, leaving it to Olga's grandson Vladimir the Great to complete her work and baptize Kievan Rus in 988 CE, an act that would ripple through centuries of Eastern European faith and politics. And so the chronicles began the long alchemy of transforming Olga from a mass murderer into a luminous figure among forgotten queens, a woman celebrated as equal to the apostles, her atrocities rebranded as righteous justice, her deceptions elevated to divine strategy, until her visage adorned icons and church frescoes, a serene saint gazing outward with eyes that betrayed nothing of the fires she once unleashed. Such is the paradox that fascinates modern historians, true crime enthusiasts, and those who study the violent women in history who shaped bloody empires with both sword and scripture. For Olga's tale forces us to question where the line truly lies between sinner and saint, between killer queens and holy women, and whether faith can ever truly erase the stains of blood once spilled. Yet even this dazzling transformation into sainthood is not the end of Olga's story, for what follows is the deeper reckoning with how we remember such figures and how history chooses which truths to illuminate and which to bury in silence. Yet even as icons of Saint Olga glow golden beneath flickering candles, even as her name is invoked in solemn prayers and carved into the marble of cathedrals across Eastern Europe, a more unsettling truth writhes beneath the surface, a truth that forces us to confront the dark side of saints and the dangerous elasticity of human memory, for the woman hailed as equal to the apostles was also one of history's bloodiest women, a killer queen whose vengeance ranks among the most violent women in history and true crime from history itself. The Orthodox Church's answer to this moral contradiction lies in doctrine through baptism. They say Olga was born anew, her sins washed away by sacred waters, her massacres transmuted into righteous justice, her cruelty reframed as divine strategy. But such theology masks a far more human reality, for her canonization was not merely a spiritual affair. It was a political weapon wielded by a church that needed royal saints to legitimize its hold over bloody empires, to show that God's grace flowed through thrones as well as altars, transforming ruthless female rulers into paragons of piety. And so history performed its alchemy, rewriting the horrors of Olga's bloody reign into tales of noble sacrifice, conveniently forgetting the screams of Drevlians suffocating beneath the earth, or burning alive in a bathhouse, or fleeing a city consumed by flames and birds turned into weapons of war. The chronicles that survived, penned by monks and court scribes, chose which details to preserve and which to bury among the unsolved mysteries of the past, creating a version of Olga suitable for stained glass and school textbooks, sanitizing the narrative to inspire loyalty, faith, and national identity. In modern Ukraine, as the country struggles to define itself amid the push and pull of geopolitics, Olga has become a symbol of strength and independence, her statues rising in public squares, her image emblazoned on currency, while the dark chapters of her story fade into the background, another casualty of selective memory. But should we be comfortable with these hidden truths of history? Should we allow killer queens and violent women in history to be reborn as saints, without ever reckoning with the rivers of blood they spilled? Or do we owe it to the ghosts of the past, to the voices of forgotten queens and entire peoples, erased from memory, to tell the story in full, no matter how unsettling its shadows? In an age of cancel culture and fierce debates over who deserves a pedestal and who deserves condemnation, Olga's paradox forces us to ask whether redemption is real or merely the prettiest mask we place over the ugliest truths. For if we believe that even the worst sinners can transform into saints, we must also accept the terrifying possibility that history's biggest cover-ups might simply be myth dressed in robes of holiness. And if we refuse to believe in such transformations, what does that say about our own capacity for forgiveness, for change, for hope, that even the darkest among us might one day choose the light? These are questions no monument can answer, no icon can resolve, for they live at the intersection of myth versus reality, where faith power and human frailty collide. And as the echoes of burning cities and buried men fade into history's silence, we turn to the final chapter of Olga's legacy to weigh whether she was monster or martyr, villain or visionary, and to ask ourselves what her story truly demands of us today. So as darkness falls across Eastern Europe on yet another July 11th, as candles flicker in quiet chapels and faithful hands trace the sign of the cross, before icons of Saint Olga we are left to reckon with a story that refuses to fit neatly into the categories of sinner or saint, villain or savior. For here stands a woman whose legacy straddles the sharpest divide in true crime from history and the dark side of saints, a killer queen whose name glimmers among the forgotten queens and violent women in history who carved bloody empires with both sword and scripture. She was a ruler who buried men alive and incinerated nobles without a flicker of remorse yet, who would also build churches, shape laws, and lay foundations for a Christian realm that would endure for centuries. Hers is a story woven of fire and gold blood and hymns, a brutal testament to the price of power and the depths of human transformation. In Olga we see proof that history's bloodiest women can become history's holiest figures, that the line between darkness and light is sometimes as thin as a blade, and that the hidden truths of history will forever haunt the shadows behind the glow of stained glass. As we ponder the moral paradox of her life, we must ask ourselves whether the icons shining in cathedrals tell the whole truth, or whether they are only beautiful masks concealing history's biggest secrets and untold stories. Does redemption truly wash away the rivers of blood, or do the sins remain simply cloaked in the robes of faith and the language of salvation? And what does it say about us that we choose to remember the saint and not the screams of those who burned or suffocated at her command? These are the questions that linger as haunting and enduring as the unsolved mysteries that cling to every forgotten queen and ruthless female ruler who ever bent history to her will. If you found yourself drawn into the shadows and brilliance of this tale, consider subscribing for more history's untold stories and hidden truths, for the chronicles of killer queens, bloody empires, and the relentless dance between human darkness and light are far from over. And perhaps that is Olga's truest legacy, that she forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that human beings are capable of both monstrous cruelty and miraculous transformation, sometimes in the same lifetime, sometimes in the same heartbeat. For in her story lies a question that echoes beyond bloody empires and forgotten queens into our own time. If someone like Olga, a woman who unleashed terror worthy of any true crime from history, could one day kneel beneath golden icons as a saint, then where does that leave our own judgments of good and evil, punishment and forgiveness? Does the darkness in us doom us forever, or is redemption always waiting for those willing to seek it, even if their hands are stained with blood? This is the paradox that haunts killer queens and violent women in history, and perhaps it's the paradox that haunts us all. So tell me, do you believe Olga deserves to be remembered as a saint, or condemned as a monster? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you hunger for more history's untold stories and the hidden truths behind the faces we call heroes, hit subscribe. Save this video for later and join me as we keep searching for the line where human darkness and light collide, for sometimes that line is where history's most powerful lessons truly begin.